their time promoting the importance of reading.
The honourable member for Colchester North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The 4-H motto, learn to do by doing, is exemplified by the Truro North River Club. They never miss an opportunity to help the community, as they recently showed by serving food at the North River Firefighters Annual Banquet. At their recent annual club rally of March 5th, guests enjoyed speeches and demonstrations on a wide variety of interesting topics. The members of the Beef Project received a $500 donation from the Farm Canada Credit to help with their project. The first-year woodsmen will compete in the 4-H rally in Brookfield in April, and 3 of the senior members will represent Colchester County and Nova Scotia at the National 4-H Citizenship Congress to be held in Ottawa in April. Many other exciting activities are planned for the coming months for this very active club and its energetic members. Thank you.
Great job. Time allotted for member statements has expired. We'll now move on to oral questions put by members to ministers. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Premier. In 2011, the now Premier criticized former Premier Dexter for, and I quote, having gone to the doorsteps of families, looked Nova Scotians in the eye and told them no tax increase, and I will table that quote. Mr. Speaker, in the last election, this Premier went to Longtail Studios in Halifax, spoke to members of the film industry and told them that he would, quote, spawn further growth in the film and digital media industries if elected. Instead, Mr. Speaker, the opposite happened. The whole industry is now at risk. So I'd like to ask the Premier, why did he look the film industry in the eye and promise to grow their business and then do the opposite after he was elected?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't agree with the premise of the question at all, Mr. Speaker. This budget has $18 million in the creative economy. There's $6 million set aside for the digital media tax credit, which not only could Longtail Studios capitalize on, but so could other digital media people in this province. We've invested in recording artists. We've invested in publishers, Mr. Speaker, as well as we have a tremendous amount of money on the table for the film tax credit and for the film industry. We're very encouraged by the conversations that we're having with representatives from Screen Nova Scotia. We're going to continue to move forward to ensure, Mr. Speaker, not only will we grow certain aspects of the creative economy, we'll grow the entire creative economy.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier may well be the only Nova Scotian left that actually believes that, Mr. Speaker. 3,000 people were here at the House just a week ago telling the government that their plan with the film tax credit would be the end of the film industry, Mr. Speaker. They are the experts. They're also the ones that saw in the Liberal platform in the last election, Mr. Speaker, that a promise made to, and I quote, strengthen Nova Scotia's heart and soul, the film tax and creative industry, by extending the film tax credit. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Premier is pretty simple. Does his discussions with the industry now include an apology for having broken his campaign promise?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have extended the film tax credit to 2020, Mr. Speaker. We have broadened the creative economy in this province. We're distributing the financial dollars that the people of this province has to ensure that we grow the entire creative economy. And yes, the film industry is part of that. Mr. Speaker, they disagreed with the delivery model that we presented to them. We've asked them to come back to us with one that works for them. We're very encouraged by the signs that we've received from them. We're very encouraged by the cooperative nature to which they're moving forward, Mr. Speaker. And the only person in this province who believes the film industry is going to die is the leader of the Conservative Party, because, Mr. Speaker, it plays better for him.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the compliment from the Premier that I somehow managed to bring 3,000 people to the legislature last Wednesday to make the very point that we're trying to make to the government, that they're an industry and the 2,700 jobs that go with it are at risk, Mr. Speaker, and they know full well. They know full well what the Premier promised them at Longtail Studios a week before Election Day. They know full well what was written into the Liberal platform, and they know that this is the opposite. Mr. Speaker, the Premier in opposition once said to Premier Dexter, and I'll quote, when will the Premier own up to his broken promises? I'll ask this Premier the same question. When will he own up to his broken promises to the film industry?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, when I break one, I'll be sure to tell all Nova Scotians.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's now the 4th day that surgeries have had to be cancelled at the province's only tertiary hospital due to problems with the sterilization of surgical equipment. And people who have waited months for needed surgeries, from open heart surgery to hip and knee replacements, are now having their surgeries cancelled, and there's no indication when surgeries will be resumed. So, Mr. Speaker, my question for the Premier is this: why is there no backup plan to ensure that surgery cancellations do not accumulate for days at the region's only tertiary hospital?
Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I'll ask the Minister of Health to respond.
Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In speaking with the Nova Scotia Health Authority, there was every indication that this was a small problem, which has occurred, in fact, in other hospitals across Canada with sterilization equipment. We're now realizing that the problem may be more extensive, and as a result, we're in the process today of contacting sources in the U.S. To get mobilizing sterilizing equipment here on site as quick as possible.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, a small problem has become an extensive problem, and now the government is scrambling. Mr. Speaker, more than 300 surgeries have now been cancelled, and the number is growing every day, Mr. Speaker. Today is day 4 of cancelled surgeries at our largest hospital. The surgeries will need to be rescheduled, putting more strain on the healthcare system that's stretched to the limit under normal circumstances, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, my question again to the Premier is this: would the Premier outline what steps will be taken to ensure there's a backup plan in place in future so this situation does not occur again?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think, Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Health has responded to that. He's doing a tremendous job, Mr. Speaker, of delivering health care services across the province, Mr. Speaker. He's continuing to ensure not only do we have the human resources in place, Mr. Speaker, that he's moving forward to ensure that we have the equipment, Mr. Speaker, that needs to be replaced on an appropriate time, Mr. Speaker. If only the former government had done the appropriate thing, was making sure not only did we have the human resource in place, but we also had the equipment that was being replaced on a timely fashion, this issue wouldn't be here today.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party on our final supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I don't need to be lectured from a Premier whose budget has no money for capital equipment in this particular budget, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there are 320 surgeries that will all have to be rescheduled when the surgical sterilization system is properly functioning, Mr. Speaker. So my final question to the Premier is, how will these surgeries be rescheduled without creating longer wait times in our healthcare system?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, there's one thing this government doesn't need to be doing is be lectured by a former Minister of Health, Mr. Speaker, when she had an opportunity, did nothing in the healthcare system but ensured, Mr. Speaker, that she embedded $700 million in the cost of doing business in this province. Mr. Speaker, when in actual fact, if she kept growth with the economy, we'd have an additional $200 million today, Mr. Speaker, to spend on all of the things she continues to complain about and the things she ignored as Minister of Health.
The Honourable Member for Sydney River, Myra, Lewisburg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of Internal Services. The forestry industry generates over $575 million for the province's GDP, and I will table a document to that effect. Northern Pulp works in cooperation with most Nova Scotia sawmills, supplying them with over 30% of their wood requirements. This is an industry that provides over 10,000 jobs in our province. This is why the plan to clean up Boat Harbour requires a plan to maintain operations at Northern Pulp. So my question to the Minister is, why does the Minister insist that Boat Harbour can be viewed in isolation when an entire industry hangs in the balance?
The Honourable Minister of Internal Services.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the Honourable Member for that question. Mr. Speaker, currently we're looking at alternatives for Northern Pulp for an effluent treatment facility, and from discussions with my department, any sort of solution we come to, and if the mill is in agreement, would require a 1 to 2 year construction period. The close down of Boat Harbour is January of 2020, which gives us a 5-year runway, so we have plenty of time to ensure that the effluent can flow somewhere else as long as the mill is in agreement. Thank you, Mr.
The honourable
Speaker.
member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, by the minister's own admission, they didn't even sit down and tell the Northern Pulp about what was going on until the day before. The Minister of Internal Services is moving to close the Boat Harbour treatment plant, and that's a good thing. There's nobody would dispute that. But a plan is needed to ensure the jobs in Northern Pulp are not lost. The benefit of this plant extends far beyond Pictou. For example, according to Roger Pike of Northern Pulp, 65% of the containerized traffic exported from the Port of Halifax is Northern Pulp products. These are jobs, Mr. Speaker, that are in the minister's own constituency. So my question to the minister is, does the minister recognize the provincial importance of ensuring that the Northern Pulp facility remains open?
The Honourable Minister of Internal Services.
Mr. Speaker, just some clarification on that. Northern Pulp exports approximately 17,000 TEUs out of approximately 500,000 that we're exporting out of the Port of Halifax. The TEU exports are very important to the Port of Halifax because it counterbalances our imports, and the more we can export, the more we can import. I would like to add that we are in a very strategic location in the world in terms of importing, because we can actually import a container into Chicago or Toronto 6 days faster out of China than you can on the West Coast, and that's what we've been promoting. We're not promoting just for Northern Pulp, we're promoting for the whole Port of Halifax around the world. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have obtained a copy of what is probably the last socioeconomic impact assessment that was done on the screen industry in Nova Scotia. This report, which I'll table, is from 2008, Mr. Speaker. The report states that the industry created 2,700 jobs and contributed $150 million to the GDP of the province back in 2008. Mr. Speaker, my question for the Premier is this. Is he aware of this report, and has he read the information in the report?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question, and she knows that information would have been part of the discussions that would have taken place as a government moving forward. We have said that the level of the tax credit in this province at 50 to 65 cents, Mr. Speaker, was too much. We've laid a proposal as part of the solution going forward, and Mr. Speaker, the industry has responded, said yes, we know changes have to be made. They're bringing back a solution, Mr. Speaker, that hopefully will work for them as well as work for taxpayers.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you very much. Well, Mr. Speaker, the socioeconomic assessment conducted by a well-respected group of economists shows us that in 2008, the sector contributed $150 million to the province's GDP. Now, Mr. Speaker, clearly, I did table it, yes, member from Digby-Clare. Clearly, the industry has grown in size since 2008, Mr. Speaker. So my question to the Premier is, why would he want to harm a growing, vibrant industry documented as an important contributor to our GDP by making such drastic cuts to the film tax credit?
The Honourable Premier.
I want to thank the Honourable Member. I want to thank those members, Mr. Speaker, of the film industry who recognized, Mr. Speaker, that changes had to be made. We have in this budget committed a substantial amount of public dollars to the creative economy. We've broadened it, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that recording artists are part of that. We've ensured that publishers are part of that. As a reference in my first question was around the digital media tax credit. There is a substantial amount of money on the table for the film industry, Mr. Speaker. What they have told us, they don't believe the delivery model of that money to them works for them. We've said, okay, tell us something that works for you, Mr. Speaker, and I've been very encouraged by the conversations that we've been having with members of the industry, Mr. Speaker. It's very different than what's happening on the floor of this House. They are being constructive, looking for a solution to ensure that we can continue to grow the economy of this province.
The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Justice. We learned today that the Burnside Jail was in lockdown after 3 separate assaults involving 3 officers on Tuesday, but none of those were reported on the Department of Justice major incident website. During estimates debate, the minister had emphasized that there is a zero-tolerance policy and that all staff at the facility must report every kind of assault, no matter how minor or serious. Will the minister explain to the House why the incidents that happened at Burnside on Tuesday were not serious enough to be posted on the department's website, but were serious enough to lock down the facility?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the honourable member for the question. I didn't say what you have just said. I said that all major incidents are reported on our website. So a major incident would include if in a case where there's hospitalization. So I can confirm that there was an assault yesterday by an offender, and I can confirm that the facility is on lockdown, but there has been no hospitalization.
The honourable member for Inverness.
And Mr. Speaker, I apologize if I've misquoted the minister. I certainly didn't intend to. But, Mr. Speaker, a spokesperson of the Department of Justice is quoted today saying that the incidents that occurred Tuesday were currently with the police. As I mentioned, they were not included on the update on the website. Several other incidents that have involved the police are posted on that list. Will the minister explain the criteria that is used to determine which incidents are handed over to the police and which incidents are considered serious enough to be posted on the website?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The facility is on lockdown, and staff is conducting their own search. So with respect to the incident you're speaking about, police is investigating, and any information with respect to that incident, you would have to consult the police. With respect to which incidents are reported, we have a clear policy, and I'd be happy to provide that to you. It is in black and white. It's documented. It is on the website, but I'd be happy to give you that information. The policy is in writing, and I can give you a copy of that. Thank you.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. My question is to the Minister of Health. We've recently become aware of another patient who's gone missing from hospital while out on a pass. The health authority says the longer he's away without treatment, the greater risk that he poses to himself. And I'll quote, table that quote. Police and hospital staff are working together to try to locate him, but time, of course, is of the essence. So my question to the Minister, can he provide an update on the situation and what failures in protocol resulted in this man's failure to return?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member opposite for that question. I reviewed this case this morning, and any time we have such an incident, it is of great concern to all those affected and impacted by a patient, and in this case, a voluntary patient at this particular site. And all protocols were initiated. Crises team started the process of going through the most likely locations where he could be, and then we have an ongoing search, of course, at this time.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
I thank the Minister for that answer. The safety of all individuals, of course, is our top priority, and getting this man back into a treatment facility, of course, is paramount. These instances are happening with more frequency and must be addressed. Health professionals and the police are fully engaged when a situation like this arises, but safeguards must be put in place prior so that, most importantly, patients are not put in harm's way. And secondly, precious resources can be used where, of course, they are needed the most, which is with treatment of these patients. Has the Minister reviewed policies to see why issues like this keep happening? And will he alert the House as to whether he will be making any changes to those policies?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for not just the question, but actually good suggestions and ideas that could be acted upon. This is, to my knowledge, the very first such incident that has been reported to the new provincial health authority. They will now look at protocols that can be, in fact, strong, robust, right across the province, as opposed to just looking at each site individually. So we will take best practices and make sure that they are in place.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, first of all, I have to say that the Premier made a statement about the film tax credit, and he said that the film community recognizes that changes needed to be made, but I have to say that they are being forced to make these changes. They did not say that these changes needed to be made. But for weeks, the Finance Minister has been stating that in spite of her decision to gut the tax credit, that the film industry would still continue to be successful in Nova Scotia. However, Valerie Creighton, President and CEO of Canadian Media Fund, challenged the minister yesterday on understanding how productions are actually funded. And she stated clearly, no tax credit, no TV shows. My question, Mr. Speaker, can the minister please explain how she now understands that the film industry funds projects?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question from the honourable member. I think that the honourable member may also have heard Ms. Creighton when she was interviewed on CBC yesterday, and one of her quotes says, "It doesn't have to be a tax credit, it could be some other form of provincial investment." So there's more to this, and we all know in this House that it's a complex issue and that it's a question that we're having of how best to support the industry with the available dollars that we have, with keeping in mind the difficulty we have to look after the taxpayers and the people of Nova Scotia.
The honourable member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I didn't exactly hear an explanation of how she feels that films are funded. However, Valerie Creighton warns that nearly $39.2 million in funding that has previously been committed to projects in Nova Scotia will disappear. These are important dollars that help leverage projects like my friend Hank White's $13 million co-production that was scheduled to be shot in Nova Scotia this summer with money from Ireland, but has now been decided to relocate in Toronto, taking millions of dollars with them and hundreds of jobs and giving them to Ontarians. My next question is, does the minister not agree that it is in her interest and that of Nova Scotia's economy to ensure that productions like these that can use the film tax credit to bring new money into the province must be saved?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I think it's very clear that from the onset we've expected and hoped that there would be a continuing industry in this province, and that's exactly what the discussions are about with the industry. And, Mr. Speaker, there's a lot less rhetoric there. There's a willingness to work together to find common ground. I would hope that every member in the House would also hope for the same outcome, that there can be a good middle ground found, a common position where the industry will thrive in this province. Thank you.
The honourable member for Pictou West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Minister of Finance. After weeks of chaos and uncertainty among Nova Scotia's film industry, the government still has not admitted that they made a mistake, admitted that they broke a promise, or accurately assessed the revenue generated by the industry. It begs to question of whether or not the government actually believes that the film and TV industry contributes positively to Nova Scotia's economy by generating jobs and income for all Nova Scotians. Why has the government been working to undermine and limit the growth of this industry by proposing damaging alternatives without advance consultation?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And again, I think the honourable member opposite is going a bit beyond the facts here in this case, because the industry has not been harmed in the way she is suggesting. The credit exists. There is $24 million in this year's budget. Everybody knows that. We're discussing the parameters for the future years and how that will affect the out years. And we're looking for the mechanism, the way to unlock the dollars so that they have the best use for Nova Scotians, the best benefit in Nova Scotia, and also continue to support an industry that requires that level of support.
The honourable member for Pictou West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the Minister for her answers, but I do know in my constituency it has been damaging. We possibly have just lost 5 films. So, in opposition, the Minister of Finance lauded that the film industry and the tax credit, saying, "We introduced the film tax credit when the Liberals were in government. It has been strengthened over time with the support of all parties," and I'll table that. The Minister was aware then that this credit, created 20 years ago, has generated significant benefits for the province of Nova Scotia and helped to grow this industry. Why did the government target the film industry in their budget after supporting the tax credit while in opposition and formalizing the support in their platform?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Somebody else's idea. Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Again, I can assure all members of the House that there was a great deal of research done. I've said here previously, research was done and it was checked and double-checked. But what's very important, and I think all of us should remember, and I've said it here in estimates at some length, there are different measures of economic impact or fiscal impact or taxes returned to the province of Nova Scotia for our investment. And we agree with Screen Nova Scotia and members of the industry that we've got two valid measures. They simply are not lined up. They're both valid. So that's very important. I'd like to, just before I finish the answer to my question, remind all members that when the credit was introduced in 1994, it covered 30% of the industry labour costs for any production, and it had a cap. And in 2010, the cap came off. Thank you.
The honourable member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Business. On November 4th, the Liberal government passed Bill number 49, an act to improve economic development in Nova Scotia. As part of that bill, that bill required that the Film and Creative Industries Nova Scotia prepare and submit to the Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism a 5-year strategic plan about the industry, and that was due March 1st, 2015. So it was required by this bill. I'm sure that 5-year strategic plan would be very helpful in light of the discussions that are now taking place. So I asked the Minister, does he have that report, and if not, why?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the report itself is in draft format, but more importantly, to my colleague's question, we recognize the importance of the industry and the people and talent that represents that industry. We also realize that there are other opportunities and options to allow that industry to grow, Mr. Speaker, and the discussions that continue as we speak are facilitating and demonstrating tremendous cooperation and, we believe, optimistic, a solution.
The honourable member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As part of that bill, the Liberal government, just 5 months ago, promised that they would extend the film industry tax credit as is, until December 31st, 2020. That was 5 months ago. A lot can change in 5 months. Maybe I'll table their own bill for their benefit, but my question for the minister is, why did they change their mind and go ahead and make significant changes to the tax credit?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And to my colleague's point, in fact, that bill did not indicate what my colleague is stating. The present situation we find ourselves in, Mr. Speaker, is there is continued support for the industry in this province and by this government, and we're continuing with open dialogue with industry leaders, a very cordial, a very respectful discussion about how collectively we can move the industry forward. My colleague knows full well the work that's being undertaken as we speak, and that we all have the same objectives in providing security and sustainability for the industry in this province. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Chester St. Margaret's.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question's to the Premier. When the Premier and the MLA for Cape Breton Richmond dismantled economic and rural development, they showed their contempt for communities outside of Halifax. Many Nova Scotians who live in rural areas see many of their services disappearing with little to no information about where to go. Their young people are leaving in droves and unemployment continues to climb. The Premier hasn't only cut services, but the good-paying jobs that went along with those services. Visitor information centres, provincial parks, land registries, offices, courthouses, and on and on. My question to the Premier, why would he take away focus from rural economic development by putting it into the disorganized Department of Business?
The Honourable Premier.
I want to thank the honourable member for her question, Mr. Speaker. I'm very proud of the fact that I have been able to live in rural Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. I'm very proud of the fact Mr. Speaker, that I've been able to create my own job in rural Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, I'm very proud of the fact that my two children have been able to be born, raised, and grown up in rural Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. One of them continues to work, and Mr. Speaker, they've invested in rural Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. I want to also remind the honourable member that in rural Nova Scotia, when you look at the best opportunity for rural Nova Scotia resource development, very encouraged by the things I'm hearing around the mining sector, very encouraged by the things I'm hearing, Mr. Speaker, from the agricultural sector, from the aquaculture. These are all positive signs. But the reality is, Mr. Speaker, unlike the honourable member across the way, rural Nova Scotians know the status quo will not get us to where we need to go. They recognize change has to come, Mr. Speaker, and they are embracing it, Mr. Speaker, like never before.
The honourable member for Chester St. Margaret's.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier can spout all the talking points and platitudes he likes, but the numbers and the facts tell a different story. Since the McNeil government has been elected, rural Nova Scotia has lost nearly 22,000 jobs, and I will table that. Also, that number includes almost 5,500 jobs in the Cape Breton area alone. In the paper this morning, we hear that communities are pulling out of regional development organizations in droves, and I will table that. How dire does the situation need to get before this Premier realizes the do-nothing approach is destroying rural Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Premier.
I want to thank the honourable member for her question. I want to tell her this is the difference between that party and this party, Mr. Speaker. They believe the only ones that can solve the economic challenges of rural Nova Scotia is the government. The fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, this party is empowering rural Nova Scotians to control their own destiny, Mr. Speaker, and they're happy to do it.
The honourable member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of Finance. A few minutes ago, the Minister of Finance said that there had been a lot of reports done, a lot of research done into the value and the actual what does the tax credit do for the people in the province of Nova Scotia. The Minister of Business has said that good talks are going on. My question is, if they had all this information, why didn't the talks take place before they created all this turmoil?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I think the important thing to note is when you bring in a budget, there are a lot of items. There are, in fact, thousands of items and many, many changes in this budget. And a lot of that is important. It has huge impacts. The industry and I met before the budget was brought in, and we agreed to meet immediately after, and we did just that. And as the members know, they've been at least 3 meetings. I think this is the 4th meeting since, and so hopefully we'll have a very good solution to this issue. We certainly have better understanding, and we're looking for a good solution.
The honourable member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I have no doubt that the job ahead of the finance minister was tough. However, in order for a business such as the film industry to be successful, they need the support of a government. A government and a premier who promised that he wasn't going to affect the tax credit. The next thing we heard, in a speech to the Halifax Chamber of Commerce, the minister says, well, we're looking at the tax credit and we might be doing something there. My question is, if people are really serious on the government side of the House about the economy of the province of Nova Scotia, why is it they create havoc instead of talk to the people that are going to be mostly affected by this change?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I think all members, again, know that I had a pre-budget tour. I met with countless different organizations. I traveled to 8 communities and had public meetings as well as meeting, again, with the Chambers of Commerce, with municipalities, municipal leaders, business leaders. So, Mr. Speaker, I've been available to meet with all industries and all people in the province.
The Honourable Member for Pictou Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Education. In 2012, the former Premier announced that a new school would be built in Eastern Passage. Last week, the government announced that the site for the new school had been selected. We are now learning that the Halifax Regional School Board members will debate a motion to ask the province to cancel building of this school, arguing that there are other areas of HRM in greater need. My question to the Minister: will the Minister comply with the wishes of the Board when it comes to the new high school in Eastern Passage?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for the question and for a little bit of the history lesson, but really not the complete history lesson. The member talked about the school being announced in 2012, neglected to talk about the process that is used in order for boards to bring forward their priorities for new school construction. And I wish to share with all members of the House that the Halifax Regional School Board never did bring forward a request for that school. It was totally a political decision.
The honourable member for Pictou Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there are other concerns regarding the future of Cole Harbour District High School. It has been indicated by the Board that as much as 50% of students would be going to the new school in Eastern Passage. Cole Harbour High is currently only operating at 81% and received an investment of $10 million in 2012 for renovations and the construction of a skilled trade centre. My question to the Minister: has the Minister discussed the future of Cole Harbour District High School with the Board, and will she ensure that the $10 million investment by taxpayers of Nova Scotia will not go to waste?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I would like to say to all members of the House that any investment in any of our schools to make learning environments better for our kids is not money that goes to waste.
The honourable member for Queens Shelburne.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Premier. Mr. Speaker, the cuts the McNeil government has made to provincial parks and visitor information centre were devastating for those families. 58 seasonal positions in 7 parks across the province were eliminated, along with closure of 2 visitor information centres. The plan is to replace park staff with machines. These were good jobs in rural Nova Scotia, and it seems to me that rural development strategies have been replaced with strategy to force people out of rural Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, my question: what advice does the Premier have for families thrown out of work in rural Nova Scotia? Should they stay or should they go?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, finally, after 17 days, they finally asked a question about, Mr. Speaker, hardworking Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, who's been affected by very tough times, being left behind by that government, Mr. Speaker. Finally, they've asked a question about the impact. And, Mr. Speaker, of course I would tell those Nova Scotians to stay, Mr. Speaker, because I think we have the best province in the entire federation, Mr. Speaker. And of course, Mr. Speaker, I would tell those Nova Scotians to stay, to work with the government to create their own opportunity in rural Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. The ingenuity of rural Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, has been here for decades. Mr. Speaker, was stymied by the last government, but they finally have a government that's prepared to work with them. Mr. Speaker, unlike the other government, the only jobs in rural Nova Scotia don't have to be government jobs, Mr. Speaker. They can be driven by the private sector.
The honourable member for Queens Shelburne.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, but I sense a little bit of anger in the air, and I can tell you under this government, under this minister, we actually brought jobs to rural Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, we brought them. We brought them. Yeah, we brought
Order,
them.
please. Order, please. The honourable member for Queens Shelburne has the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, since October 2013, 3,200 jobs have been lost. I repeat, lost in southwest Nova and on the South Shore, according to Statistics Canada's numbers. That's a change in employment of a negativity of 6.31%. But those just aren't numbers, Mr. Speaker. Those are families. Each job cut by this Premier makes rural Nova Scotia is one less person spending their paycheck at a local business. I'm getting there, Mr. Speaker. The question, Mr. Premier, to the Premier, I asked the Premier, what talks about creating the right environment for business? How is cutting jobs in rural Nova Scotia improving the environment for business?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I think we sense a Freudian slip in the air. Mr. Speaker, I would say that was their economic development, Mr. Speaker, was to try to buy jobs and move them around this province, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we've recognized, and Nova Scotians recognize, that was failed public policy. The fact of the matter is, every day, Mr. Speaker, hard-working Nova Scotians in rural Nova Scotia and urban Nova Scotia are putting their own money on the line, Mr. Speaker, are investing in their own business, Mr. Speaker. What they've asked their government to do is get their financial house in order, Mr. Speaker, ensure that they provide...
Order, please. The Honourable Premier has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Every day in this province, hard-working Nova Scotians are putting their own money on the line in rural Nova Scotia, in urban Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. What they've asked their government to do is get the financial house in order, ensure that we can provide health care, ensure that we provide education, making sure our most vulnerable citizens in this province can be looked after. And, Mr. Speaker, I believe in Nova Scotians. Nova Scotians don't look for their government, Mr. Speaker, to create them a job, Mr. Speaker. All they've asked of the Nova government, Mr. Speaker, is ensure the environment is healthy. And finally, Mr. Speaker, they have a government that's prepared to work with them, not one that's prepared to hold them back.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, last night there was another meeting about the status of home care in Nova Scotia. A full House was concerned about the proposed RFP and the effect it may have on the ability to provide quality home care. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister of Health and Wellness is, can the Minister assure workers and patients that the standards of care and the amount of care needed will remain in place or be a part of this RFP?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The member opposite put those exact words into place already for me. We will not be changing the quality. In fact, we want to improve the service in Nova Scotia. We currently have some areas that are underserviced. We have some areas that are very, very inefficient in terms of delivery of service, and all those who are providing good care, bringing care to our seniors and disabled in their homes, all of those people will have jobs as long in the future as they so wish.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Minister for that answer. With the changes in the admission requirements for nursing homes, there is a fear that more people will need home care, especially if they refuse admission. It is felt that the more care will be needed and the wait list will grow. Can the Minister assure patients and families that if there more resources are needed, they will be available for their loved ones?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I know the member opposite is very concerned and passionate about this issue for his riding, and I want to assure him that we have hundreds of thousands of dollars now spent inefficiently across Nova Scotia. This is about sharpening the pencil. This is about a new way of delivering high-quality care. And this is why the tendering process will be part of the future. In 1998, in 2002, in 2008, the Auditor General said this is the way the province should go.
The Honourable Member for Colchester, Musqueam Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Fisheries. I met with the Nova Scotia Striped Bass Association a couple of weeks ago at their annual meeting, and one of the main items of business was the concern for the fish in the Shubenacadie River. The concern arises from the possible effect the Alton Gas project will have on the fish. So my question is, has the department completed their studies on what the effect on fish might be with respect to the salt content created by the salt caverns?
The Honourable Minister of Fisheries.
I'd like to defer that question to the Minister responsible for that. Whatever.
Not much anymore. The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, for the
members' information, the KMK has just recently closed an RFP request for a third-party review of the scientific evidence that has been gathered to date regarding the Alton project. This review will be underway very soon. Once the findings have been concluded, we will continue our discussions and our negotiations with the Mi'kmaq chiefs in Nova Scotia and all Mi'kmaq people to ensure that they are confident that the science shows that this project is sustainable and that it will protect the environment.
The honourable member for Colchester, Musquodoboit Valley.
My final question is, will the minister afford the opportunity for the association to review the data once it's finished?
The honourable Minister of Energy.
Speaker, this is an open process. This project, we want to ensure that all Nova Scotians are confident in this. This represents a tremendous opportunity. It's been identified that it could provide savings of approximately $17 million a year for natural gas users in our province. It would bring stability to that market, and as well as having a reserve supply. At the same time, the whole intent here is to ensure that there is confidence that there will not be any impact on the Shubenacadie River with the salt water that will be put back into a saltwater basin. But obviously, we want to share all of that information and address any concerns that there are.
The honourable member for Queens Shelburne.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Premier. Mr. Speaker, back in 2012, the Premier, the current Premier, said, and I quote, "The government does not have a financial problem, it has a priority problem." End of quote. Well, Mr. Speaker, today people living in rural Nova Scotia are saying the McNeil government has a priority problem. One community in particular that is questioning this government's priority is Guysborough, who last month has lost the land restoration offices, their satellite court, and several children welfare workers. So my question to the Premier is, why is he providing quality frontline services to seniors, families, and small business in Guysborough not a priority with this government? The
Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I couldn't disagree with the question from the honourable member any more vehemently, Mr. Speaker. I do want to remind, and it's quite interesting, he talks about us having our priorities wrong, and yesterday or 2 days ago, the leader of that party stood up and criticized us for settling a long-standing dispute with the Nova Scotia Home for Coloured Children. It's an embarrassment. Mr. Speaker, let me tell you, Mr. Speaker, the people of Guysborough, Mr. Speaker, aren't looking to their government to solve their problems. Mr. Goldborough is moving forward, Mr. Speaker, because of the ingenuity of the people of Guysborough, Mr. Speaker. We're looking forward to Vulcan investing in that community, not because of government, Mr. Speaker, but because of the good people of Guysborough County, Mr. Speaker. They recognize their futures in their own hands, and they're moving forward.
The honourable member for Queens Shelburne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It seems like I've hit a nerve, but I know when I don't get an answer. Mr. Speaker, there's another community, Mr. Speaker, another community that has seen jobs and services disappear at the hands of the McNeil government is Liverpool. It has lost land restraints office and also a satellite court, Mr. Speaker. During the last election, this
Order,
Premier
please.
told
The honourable member for Queens Shelburne has the floor.
Start over again, Mr. Speaker. Okay, Mr. Speaker. Another community that has seen jobs and services disappear at the hands of the McNeil government is Liverpool. It has lost its land restoration offices and its satellite court office. Mr. Speaker, during the last election, the Premier told the Canadian press that one of his priorities was to expand rural economics. So my question to the Premier is, how is eliminating jobs and services expanding rural communities?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I again want to remind the honourable member, Mr. Speaker, the people who live in rural Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, aren't looking for their government to solve all the challenges facing their community, Mr. Speaker. They're looking directly to their government to get their fiscal health in order, Mr. Speaker. I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, I made a living in rural Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. My wife has made a living in rural Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, and never once did we ask the government to help solve our economic challenges, Mr. Speaker. We stood up and did it ourselves, Mr. Speaker. And let me tell you, well, that member and that party doesn't have faith in people who live in rural Nova Scotia. This Premier and this government does.
The Honourable House Leader for the official opposition.
Those workers aren't begging for jobs. They're begging for
Order, please. Order, please. Are you ready? The Honourable Member for Argyle-Barrington.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I was going to ask a really good question about surgical wait times, but I think I'll save it and I'll ask a question about dialysis in rural areas. I do want to thank the Minister for meeting with a group of concerned citizens in Barrington Passage who are concerned about those individuals in Southwest Nova Scotia, more specifically Cape Island, Shelburne County side of things, who are having a hard time getting to their dialysis appointments in Yarmouth, specifically during the winter season when we've had lots of trouble with the roads and being able to get there. And no problem because of the roads and the Department of Transportation, but just simply because we've had some terrible weather. So my question to the Minister would be, is there anything else that we can tell the members of that dialysis committee on whether the information will be coming forward on whether or not this is a good idea for that area?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Yes, I was pleased to meet with those citizens. They obviously have a very real concern. We are gathering information at the department. The member is quite aware that we are involved with a provincial renal program, and that's where we will take our guidance from. One of the areas that I want to see expanded in our province is home dialysis. We're currently at the 17% level. BC is at 30%. I think that's where we can eventually move dialysis, is more and more into home. Once again, that's where residents want to get the care that can be provided there.
Order, please. The time allotted for oral questions by members to ministers, thankfully, has expired. We'll now move on to government business. The Honourable Member for Pictou West on an introduction.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And if I can draw the Chamber's attention to the West Gallery, I'm really thrilled and honoured to be able to introduce the Warden of Pictou County, Mr. Ron Bailey, as well as Mayor of New Glasgow, Barry McMillan. So
We'll now move on to government business. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I move that you do now leave the chair and that the House resolve itself into a committee of the whole on supply.
The House will now resolve itself into the Committee on Whole House on Supply and will now enter into supply debate. The Honourable Member for Colchester, Musquodoboit Valley.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I am very pleased to